I've always been good at blending into the background. It's not that I'm invisible, I just prefer to be. People don't notice you when you're quiet, and I like it that way. It gives me time to observe, to sketch, to write. The world feels less overwhelming when I can filter it through my pencil or my words. But then he walked in, and suddenly, I couldn't look away. It was a Monday morning, the kind that drags its feet and smells like stale coffee and wet pavement. I was sitting in my usual spot by the window in art class, my sketchbook open on the desk, pretending to work on an assignment. The truth was, I'd been doodling aimlessly for the past 10 minutes, my mind wandering to the poem I'd scribbled in the margins of my notebook earlier that morning. Something about the way the rain hit the glass made me think of loneliness, of longing. I was trying to capture it, but the words felt clumsy, like they didn't belong to me. That's when the door opened, and he walked in. At first, I thought he was a substitute teacher. He had this air about him, calm, composed, like he didn't care what anyone thought. His black hair was slicked back, the silver tips catching the light like they were dipped in moonlight. He was taller than most of the guys in our class, with sharp features that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. But it wasn't just his looks that caught my attention. It was the way he carried himself, like he was untouchable, like the world couldn't reach him. "Class, this is Ren," our teacher said, gesturing toward him. "He's a transfer student. Make him feel welcome." Ren didn't say anything. He just nodded, his dark eyes scanning the room like he was sizing us up. When his gaze landed on me, I froze. It was only for a second, but it felt like he could see right through me, like he knew every secret I'd ever tried to hide. Then he looked away, and I could breathe again. The teacher pointed to the empty seat next to me. "You can sit there." "Great. Just great." I ducked my head, pretending to be engrossed in my sketchbook as Ren made his way over. I could feel the weight of him as he sat down, the faint scent of something clean and sharp, like cedarwood and rain, filling the space between us. I told myself not to look at him, but my eyes betrayed me. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw him pull out a notebook and a pen, his movements precise and deliberate. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was the way the light hit his face, casting shadows along his jawline. Maybe it was the way he sat, so still and composed, like a statue carved from stone. Or maybe it was just me being me, always looking for something to draw, something to capture. Whatever it was, my pencil started moving before I could stop it. At first, I told myself it was just practice. Quick, loose lines to warm up my hand. But the more I sketched, the more I got lost in the details, the curve of his neck, the way his hair fell just slightly out of place, the intensity in his eyes even when he wasn't looking at anything in particular. I didn't realize how much time had passed until the bell rang, jolting me out of my trance. I slammed my sketchbook shut, my heart racing. Did he notice? Did anyone notice? I glanced at Ren, but he was already packing up his things, his expression unreadable. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and shoved my sketchbook into my bag, my hands trembling. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not just about how he looked, but about the way he made me feel, like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't understand. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the sketch I'd made of him. It wasn't perfect, his jawline was a little too sharp, and I'd messed up the shading on his hair, but it felt alive in a way my drawings usually didn't. I traced the lines with my finger, wondering what it was about him that made me want to draw him in the first place. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I wanted to see him again. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't look at him. I wouldn't even think about him. Ren was just another student, another face in the crowd. I'd drawn him once, and that was enough. I had no reason to obsess over someone I didn't even know. But the moment he walked into the classroom, all my resolve crumbled. He had this way of commanding attention without even trying. It wasn't loud or flashy, he didn't need to be. It was in the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't glance at me as he slid into the seat next to mine, but I could feel his presence, like a quiet hum in the air. My fingers itched to pick up my pencil, but I clenched them into fists instead, determined to focus on the lesson. It didn't work. By the time the teacher started droning on about perspective and vanishing points, my mind was already wandering. I found myself sneaking glances at Ren out of the corner of my eye. He was leaning back in his chair, his notebook open in front of him, but he wasn't writing anything. His pen tapped against the page in a slow, steady rhythm, like he was lost in thought. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the silver tips of his hair, making them glow like threads of light. Before I knew it, my sketchbook was open and my pencil was moving. This time, I didn't hold back. I let myself get lost in the lines, the curves, the shadows. I wanted to capture everything, the sharpness of his jaw, the way his hair framed his face, the quiet intensity in his eyes. It felt like I was trying to solve a puzzle, to understand something about him that words couldn't explain. I was so focused, so completely absorbed, that I didn't notice him looking at me. "Is that me?" His voice was low, calm, but it hit me like a thunderclap. My pencil froze mid-stroke, and my heart stopped. Slowly, like a guilty child caught stealing cookies, I lifted my head. Ren was staring at me, his dark eyes unreadable, his expression a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. My mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. My brain scrambled for an excuse, a lie, anything to get me out of this, but nothing came. My face burned, and I wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. Ren leaned closer, his gaze dropping to the sketchbook still open on my desk. "Can I see?" "No." The word came out louder than I intended, and a few heads turned in our direction. I slammed the sketchbook shut, clutching it to my chest like it was a lifeline. "It's not finished," I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look offended. If anything, he looked amused. The corner of his mouth twitched, like he was fighting back a smile. "All right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But you're pretty good." I could tell it was me. I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was still reeling from the fact that he'd caught me, that he'd seen. I felt exposed, like he'd peeled back a layer of me I wasn't ready to share. The rest of the class passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything the teacher said, couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Every time I glanced at Ren, he was either scribbling in his notebook or staring out the window, completely unbothered. Meanwhile, I was a mess of nerves, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my pencil. When the bell finally rang, I bolted out of the classroom, clutching my sketchbook like it was a secret diary. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey!" I jumped, nearly dropping my sketchbook. Ren was standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression as calm as ever. How did he move so quietly? It was like he just appeared out of nowhere. "Relax," he said, holding up his hands like he was trying to calm a skittish animal. "I'm not mad or anything. I just wanted to say, it's cool. The drawing, I mean." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process his words. "You're not mad? Why would I be mad?" He shrugged, his gaze steady. "It's not like you were making fun of me or anything. You were just drawing." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to thank him, to tell him how much it meant that he wasn't angry, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, clutching my sketchbook tighter. Ren tilted his head, studying me like I was the one he wanted to draw. "You're quiet," he said after a moment. "But you've got talent. I can tell." My face burned again, but this time it wasn't just from embarrassment. There was something in his voice, something genuine, that made my chest feel tight. I didn't know how to respond, so I just mumbled, "Thanks," and looked away. He didn't press me. He just nodded, like that was enough, and turned to leave. But before he walked away, he glanced over his shoulder and said, "See you tomorrow, Kael." It wasn't until he was gone that I realized I'd never told him my name. The next day, I told myself I'd keep my head down. No more staring, no more sketching, no more Ren. But, of course, life had other plans. It started in the cafeteria. I was sitting at my usual table in the corner, the one no one else ever bothered with. It was perfect, quiet, out of the way, and close enough to the window that I could watch the rain streak down the glass. I had my sketchbook open, pretending to work on a new drawing, but my mind kept drifting back to yesterday. To Ren. To the way he'd caught me, the way he'd said my name like it was something worth remembering. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice him until he was standing right in front of me. "Mind if I sit here?" I blinked up at him, my brain short-circuiting. Ren. At my table, holding a tray of food like it was the most normal thing in the world. Sure," I managed to stammer, quickly shoving my sketchbook into my bag. My heart was already racing, and he hadn't even sat down yet. He slid into the seat across from me, setting his tray down with a quiet clink. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He just started eating, completely unfazed, while I sat there trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Why was he here? Out of all the tables in the cafeteria, why mine? "You always sit alone?" he asked, breaking the silence. I shrugged, suddenly very interested in the sandwich I hadn't touched. "I guess." "Why?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced up at him, but his expression was unreadable, like he was genuinely curious. "I don't know," I said finally. "I just like the quiet." He nodded, like that made perfect sense. "Me too." That was the first thing I learned about Ren. He wasn't much of a talker. He didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter or try to force a conversation. He just existed, like the quiet was something we could share. It was strange, but not in a bad way. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself or pretend to be someone I wasn't. We didn't talk much during lunch, but when the bell rang, he looked at me and said, "You're coming to the gym after school, right?" I blinked. "The gym?" "Yeah. For dance practice." I stared at him, completely confused. "I don't dance." He smirked, and for a second, I thought he was joking. But then he said, "You will." I don't know why I went. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way he said it, like it wasn't a question but a fact. Or maybe it was just Ren himself, this strange, magnetic force I couldn't seem to resist. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing outside the gym after school, my heart pounding in my chest. When I walked in, the first thing I noticed was the music. It was loud, pulsing, the kind of beat that made you want to move even if you didn't know how. Ren was standing in the middle of the room, his jacket tossed onto a nearby bench, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked different here, looser, more relaxed, like he belonged in this space. "You made it," he said, his smirk returning. I crossed my arms, trying to ignore the way my stomach flipped. "I still don't know why I'm here." He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle. "You're an artist, right?" I frowned. "Yeah." "Then you already know how to dance." I blinked at him, completely lost. "What?" He stepped closer, his movements smooth and deliberate, like he was already dancing. Art is about rhythm, flow, movement. Dancing's the same thing. You just have to feel it. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could say anything, he grabbed my hand and pulled me into the center of the room. My brain short-circuited. Ren was holding my hand. Ren was touching me. "Relax," he said, his voice low and calm. "Just follow me." The next thing I knew, the music started, and Ren began to move. At first, I was too stunned to do anything but stand there, my feet glued to the floor. But then I started to notice the way he moved, fluid, effortless, like the music was a part of him. It wasn't flashy or over the top. It was beautiful. "Your turn," he said, letting go of my hand. I froze. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "Just try." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. But then I thought about what he'd said earlier, about rhythm, about flow. About how art and dance were the same thing. Slowly, awkwardly, I started to move. It wasn't graceful or coordinated, but it was something. Ren watched me, his expression unreadable. "Not bad," he said after a moment. "But you're too stiff. Loosen up." I tried, but it was easier said than done. Every time I moved, I felt like a complete idiot. My arms were too long, my legs too short, and my body just didn't seem to know what to do. I was about to give up when Ren stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "Here," he said, his voice soft. "Like this." He guided me, his movements slow and deliberate, and for the first time, I started to feel it, the rhythm, the flow. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared, like it was just me and Ren and the music. When the song ended, I was out of breath, my heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with dancing. Ren stepped back, his smirk returning. "See? Told you could do it." I didn't know what to say. My mind was still reeling, my body buzzing with adrenaline. All I could do was nod, my face burning. As I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, Ren called out, "Same time tomorrow?" I glanced back at him, my chest tightening at the sight of his easy smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow." By the time I walked into the gym the next day, I'd convinced myself that yesterday had been a fluke. Ren probably wouldn't even remember inviting me. Maybe he'd just been messing with me, or maybe he'd found someone else to teach, someone who didn't trip over their own feet every 5 seconds. But there he was, waiting for me. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, scrolling through his phone. His jacket was draped over a bench, and his hair was slightly messier than usual, like he hadn't bothered to slick it back all the way. For some reason, that small detail made him seem softer, less untouchable. "You're late," he said without looking up. I froze in the doorway, clutching the strap of my bag. "I didn't know we had a schedule." He smirked, finally glancing up at me. "We do now." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the small smile tugging at my lips. There was something about the way he said it, teasing, but not unkind, that made me feel lighter. Like maybe I didn't have to be so guarded around him. "Come on," he said, standing up and stretching. "We've got work to do." The next hour was a blur of music, movement, and Ren's voice guiding me through every misstep. He was patient, surprisingly so, but he didn't let me off the hook either. Every time I stumbled or hesitated, he'd stop the music and make me start over. It was frustrating, exhausting, and kind of exhilarating. "You're overthinking it," he said for the third time, his hands on his hips. "Stop trying to be perfect. Just feel the music." That's easy for you to say, I muttered, wiping sweat from my forehead. You make it look effortless. He raised an eyebrow, his smirk softening into something almost thoughtful. You think this is effortless? I blinked, caught off guard by the question. I mean, yeah. You're good at it. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the bench and grabbed a water bottle, taking a long sip before sitting down. For a moment, I thought he was going to brush it off, but then he said, I wasn't always. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? He leaned back, resting his elbows on the bench, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. When I first started dancing, I was terrible. Like, really terrible. I couldn't keep up with the music, I kept forgetting the steps. I almost quit a dozen times. I stared at him, trying to imagine Ren, calm, confident, untouchable Ren, struggling with anything. It didn't seem possible. What changed? He shrugged, his expression unreadable. I stopped caring what people thought. I stopped trying to be perfect and just let myself enjoy it. His words hit me harder than I expected. I thought about my sketchbook, about the way I'd always hidden my drawings, afraid of what people might say. I thought about my poetry, the words I never let anyone read because they felt too raw, too personal. I thought about my father, his voice sharp and unforgiving, telling me to focus on real goals instead of wasting my time on art. Easier said than done, I muttered, more to myself than to him. Ren's gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, I felt like he could see right through me. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. After practice, we sat on the floor, our backs against the wall, catching our breath. The gym was quiet now, the music turned off, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. I was exhausted, my legs aching, but for the first time in a long time, I felt good. Like I'd accomplished something, even if it was small. You're getting better, Ren said, breaking the silence. I snorted. I tripped over my own feet like 5 times. 4, he corrected, smirking. But who's counting? I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped. Thanks, I guess. He didn't respond right away. When I glanced at him, his expression had softened, his smirk replaced by something quieter. Why do you draw? He asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, my fingers fidgeting with the hem of my shirt. I don't know, I said finally. It just helps. When everything feels too loud or too much, drawing makes it quieter. It's like I can breathe again. Ren nodded, like he understood. That's how dancing is for me. I looked at him, surprised. Really? He shrugged, his gaze distant. Yeah. It's the only time I feel like I can be myself. Like I don't have to pretend to be whatever people expect me to be. His words hung in the air, heavy with something unspoken. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I didn't know how. Instead, I said, You don't seem like the type to care what people think. He let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. You'd be surprised. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt safe. Like we were sharing something neither of us could put into words. Thanks for teaching me, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ren glanced at me, his smirk returning. Don't thank me yet. We've still got a long way to go. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the smile tugging at my lips. Great. Can't wait. As we stood up and grabbed our things, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't dreading tomorrow. I wasn't thinking about my father's expectations or the weight of everything I'd been carrying. I was just looking forward to seeing Ren again. And that scared me more than anything. I didn't expect to find myself on the school rooftop that evening. Then again, I didn't expect a lot of things when it came to Ren. It started after practice. We'd been working on a new routine. Well, he had been working on it. I was mostly trying not to trip over my own feet. Ren had been unusually quiet that day, his usual smirk replaced by something more subdued. He didn't tease me when I messed up, didn't push me to start over when I got the steps wrong. He just nodded, said, "Let's take a break," and walked out of the gym. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to give him space, but another part of me, one I didn't quite understand, wanted to follow him. So I did. I found him on the rooftop, leaning against the railing, his back to me. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the kind of colors that made me wish I'd brought my sketchbook. Ren didn't turn around when I stepped onto the roof, but I knew he'd heard me. He always seemed to know when I was there. "You're not supposed to be up here," I said, my voice quiet. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Neither are you." I hesitated, then walked over to stand beside him. The air was cool, the faint smell of rain lingering from the afternoon storm. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt heavy, like there was something unspoken hanging between us. "You okay?" I asked finally. Ren let out a soft laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're the first person to ask me that in a long time." I frowned, unsure how to respond. Ren always seemed so composed, so untouchable. It was strange to see him like this, quiet, almost vulnerable. "Well, are you?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced at him, but his gaze was still fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, like you're not allowed to be yourself. Like no matter what you do, it's never enough." My chest tightened. I knew that feeling all too well. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I do." Ren finally looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine. "What do you do about it?" I hesitated, my fingers fidgeting with the hem of my shirt. "I draw," I admitted. "It doesn't fix anything, but it helps. For a little while, at least." He nodded, like he understood. "For me, it's dancing. It's the only time I feel like I can breathe." I wanted to say something, to tell him I understood, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I just stood there, the silence stretching between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt safe. Like we didn't need to fill the space with words. After a while, Ren spoke again. "You know, when I first started dancing, I didn't tell anyone. Not even my family. I was afraid they'd think it was stupid, or that I wasn't good enough." I frowned. "But you're amazing." He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Not back then. I was terrible. But I kept at it, even when I wanted to quit. And eventually, it became the one thing I couldn't live without." I thought about my sketchbook, about the way drawing had always been my escape. I thought about the poems I wrote late at night, the ones I never let anyone read. "I get that," I said quietly. "Art's the same for me. It's the only thing that feels like mine." Ren looked at me, his expression softening. "You should show people your work." I shook my head, my chest tightening at the thought. "I can't. What if they don't like it? What if they think it's stupid?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle. "Who cares what they think? If it makes you happy, that's all that matters." I wanted to believe him. I really did. but years of hearing my father's voice in the back of my mind, telling me to focus on real goals, to stop wasting my time on art, weren't so easy to ignore. "It's not that simple," I muttered. Ren didn't argue. He just nodded, like he understood, and turned back to the horizon. For a while, we just stood there, watching the sun dip below the skyline. The air was cool, the sky fading from orange to deep blue, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. "You're better than you think you are," Ren said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. "At drawing. At dancing. At everything. You just don't see it yet." I stared at him, my chest tightening at his words. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. Not my teachers, not my friends, definitely not my father. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Ren glanced at me, his smirk returning. "Don't let it go to your head, though. You've still got a lot to learn." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the small smile tugging at my lips. "Thanks, I guess." He grinned, and for a moment, the weight in his eyes seemed to lift. "Anytime." As we headed back inside, I realized something. Ren wasn't as untouchable as I thought. He had cracks in his armor, just like I did. And for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. The park was quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the rhythmic sound of Ren's sneakers brushing against the pavement as he danced. I sat on the bench, my sketchbook balanced on my knees, pencil in hand, but I wasn't drawing. Not yet. I was too busy watching him. Ren moved with a kind of grace that I could never capture on paper, no matter how hard I tried. His silver-tipped hair caught the sunlight, glowing like a halo, and his expression was so focused, so intense, that it made my chest tighten. He was beautiful in a way that made me want to draw him 1,000 times, even if I never got it right. "Are you going to stare at me all day, or are you actually going to draw something?" Ren's voice broke through my thoughts, and I realized he'd stopped dancing. He was standing in front of me now, his hands on his hips, a teasing smirk on his face. I felt my cheeks heat up. "I wasn't staring," I mumbled, looking down at my sketchbook. "Sure you aren't." He sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. "Let me see what you've got so far." I hesitated, clutching the sketchbook to my chest. "It's not finished." "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said, his voice softer now. "I just want to see it." Reluctantly, I handed it over. Ren flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning each sketch with a kind of quiet reverence that made my heart race. When he reached the last page, he smiled, a real, genuine smile that made my breath catch. "You're amazing, Kael," he said, handing the sketchbook back to me. "You don't give yourself enough credit." I looked down at the drawing, my fingers tracing the lines of his face. "I'm only amazing because you inspire me." Ren laughed, a soft, warm sound that made me smile despite myself. "You're such a sap," he said, nudging me with his shoulder. "But I'll take it." We sat there in comfortable silence, the sun dipping lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If you enjoyed our story, don't forget to subscribe to Boy Heart Stories for more heartfelt tales of love, growth, and connection. See you in the next story.